Hi, this is Madison Carney presenting for week 7, dealing with the question on man being created in the image and likeness of God. So to begin this week's presentation, I would like to recall a line from Aquinas at the beginning of his Sed Contra in question 93, in which he writes, "Since man is said to be the image of God by reason of his intellectual nature, he is most perfectly like God, according as his intellectual nature can most imitate God." So, as we see in this line, man is thus the image of God through his intellectual nature. This nature, in turn, is what allows him to both understand and love God. With regards to this week's question, this line, I think, may be interpreted both in the sense of the universal man as the image of God, but also as the individual man as the image of God, which is a point that I intend on returning to later. But in both cases, both in the case of the universal and the individual man, Aquinas presents 3 ways in which the image of God may be considered in man. And one of my peers in this week's discussion called these ways degrees of perfection. So the first way is most fundamental, in that we all enter this world with what Aquinas calls a natural aptitude for understanding and loving God. Therefore, we are all equally made in the image of God, since we are all made by God and since we all possess a mind. The second way is man's knowing and loving God, though imperfectly and through conformity of grace. And this is how we know God in this life. The third way is man's knowing and loving God both perfectly and continually. And this way belongs to those who behold the beatific vision and who have, I think Aquinas would say, recovered their likeness to God. Now, I think that the second way is what's being referred to in this week's question. We are asked, isn't the idea of one person being more in the image of God than another tantamount to denying the equality of human beings and the fairness of God? And I would answer no. It is not tantamount to denying the equality of human beings. We are all made in God's image, and we are all capable of conforming to that image by accepting the graces that God extends. Aquinas makes this conformity of grace clear in his explanation of the second way, thus showing that it is not enough to merely have the natural capacity to know God. Rather, we are called to grow in that capacity through grace. We're called to grow in our knowledge and thus to become a more perfect image. And we must note that we all have an equal chance to become that more perfect image. But at the same time, we must also recognize that some people conform more to grace than others. Some people even have more grace than others. And this is where I want to turn back to my earlier point of the universal versus the individual man. Because Aquinas says that man becomes more perfectly like God insofar as his intellectual nature can imitate God. And I would say that we as individuals have our God-given capacity to know him to our own fullest ability. So, for example, it doesn't make sense, at least to me, to claim that Aquinas is fundamentally more of an image of God than I am. However, I would be the first to assert that he, even when he was alive on earth, is much more like God than I am for a number of reasons. And these reasons have to do with the levels of intellectual capacity. So first of all, I am still discovering my intellectual capacity, whereas he is writing as a mature thinker and grounded in his own spiritual life, etc. And second, Aquinas was clearly called to be a leading figure in theology and philosophy, and thus accordingly was gifted with both the mind and the grace needed to fulfill his vocation. Whereas my vocational discernment continues and my maturity is still developing, right? So I don't know my own intellectual capacity. I don't know to what extent I can fully love God yet, right? And so I'm still growing in that respect, whereas Aquinas, in a sense, had already arrived and thus had achieved more of a perfect likeness to God than where I am right now. So to return to the second half of this week's question, does that mean that God is being unfair in giving Aquinas more grace, or like a stronger mind than he gave me? Again, I don't think so, because we are two different people with two different callings, two different vocations, and thus with our own levels of the capacity to conform to grace. To begin to wrap up, I will offer two more illustrations, both which have to do with more of an intentional refusal to work with the grace given. So first, let's think of becoming the more perfect image as a movement toward perfection. So those who have become more and more Christ-like are more in conformity to the image of God that resides within them, while those who ignore God throughout their lives are still made in the image and likeness of him, but they're kind of static, right? There's no real growth. Again, we all possess this image, but this image is designed to be perfected and to be filled with knowledge and love. Some fill it, others don't, but all are invited to do so. And we do this by cooperating with grace. And again, some are given more grace than others, and that is, I think, at the heart of it, like just God's choice in the end. And trust, The second example, was provided by one of my peers, has to do with choosing to participate in that grace. So the example that he gave was one of marriage. So a husband and wife can be married, but living lives estranged from each other. Now, they are in some sense no less married than any other married couple, no less than a couple who live together and try to mostly cooperate, or the couple who are intensely committed to each other and, committed to each other in selfless acts of mutual giving, etc. So in one sense, they all enjoy the same status of marriage, being married, but with greater degrees of intimacy, participation, cooperation, self-giving love, etc. Now, is their participation or lack thereof God's fault? No, because they have free will, right? They are invited to give themselves, but can obviously refuse to do so. The same idea, I think, applies to question 93. Man can choose to what extent he will comply with the grace to know and love God. So some people accept the grace more, some less, but I think to frame the question in terms of equality, does God create us all equally, is not perhaps quite the most accurate understanding of how God works. And I would say that God loves us all justly, not necessarily equally. He gives us each the grace that we need as individuals to reach him. Some individuals may receive more according to God's particular plan for them, but all are called to be the perfect image of God that they have the ability to be. Thank you.